So we've entered the domain of generative linguistics now. This is the combination of semantics, syntax, morphology, and phonology, which together emerged as a theoretical framework after the Second World War, a little later, 50s and 60s, largely under the influence of Noam Chomsky of MIT. Now, Noam Chomsky's particular concern was with what we call syntax. Syntax means the rules that govern which sequences of words are admissible within a language and which are not. So John kicked the ball is a fine English sentence, but ball that John kicked is not. Chomsky came from a background in computation. He had studied the mathematics of computer languages, and he started applying this to human languages. And his approach was so successful that it became, as we said, one of the linchpins of a growing computational theory of mind with all sorts of implications. So what was Chomsky looking at? Well, here you see a very famous sentence, which Chomsky generated himself: colorless green ideas sleep furiously. Now, he chose this sentence, which is a peculiar sentence, in order to illustrate the fact that the question of whether a sequence of words is grammatical, that is an acceptable sentence, is independent of the meaning. Chomsky made the, to me, rather remarkable claim that this sentence is meaningless. You can't be colorless and green, ideas don't sleep, sleeping can't be done furiously. On the other hand, you could look at it as a piece of poetry and it seems perfectly fine. But his point was that this is an acceptable English sentence even if it means nothing. So let's have a look at this, and you can see there's a diagram drawn over this sentence. Let's have a good look at that. The diagram begins with the words, colorless green ideas sleep furiously, and each word belongs to a small class of words. So we have the class of nouns, which are the names of things, basically. Verbs, which are actions. Adjectives, which modify nouns. So green is an adjective, colorless is an adjective. Adverbs, which modify verbs. So furiously is an adverb here. And there are other, what we call parts of speech. But basically, in any given language, there's only a few parts of speech: nouns, verbs, adjectives, adverbs, and a few more. And they can only be combined in certain ways. So adjectives, as we've said, modify nouns. And so you can see here green ideas, an adjective and a noun, together form what's called a noun phrase. So this conjunction of two words, green ideas, could occur in other contexts as well. Furthermore, here, let's build this tree a bit more. Colorless green ideas forms another noun phrase, a larger noun phrase with a noun phrase within it. Do you see how this tree is being built up? Likewise, the verb sleep is modified by furiously, forming a verb phrase. And so this sentence consists of a noun phrase and a verb phrase, as does John kicked the ball. Furthermore, we've got a noun phrase nested within another noun phrase. This is something known as recursion, a property that will come to take on formidable importance in the debate about human language later on, but we won't concern ourselves with that right now. You just get an idea here of the kind of structure that Chomsky, in studying syntax, is concerned with. Now, the rules that govern which sequences of words are admissible within a language are known as a grammar. And you'll have met the word grammar in school when you were learning French or Italian or Irish or Latin even. And the sense here is slightly different. When you encounter a grammar in school, it's rules telling you what to do, saying, thou shalt do this, thou shalt not do that. But linguists are not teachers. They're scientists of a peculiar sort. And so their job is not to tell people what to do, but to find out what the rules are that people actually follow. So we need to keep this distinction clear, that although syntax is concerned with grammar and rules, these are not human creations by fiat. We didn't tell people what to do. Rather, linguists go out and see what they do. Linguists always have this problem of parties. They're mistaken for grammar Nazis. And so let's just be quite clear on this. There are two possible approaches to linguistic grammar. One is prescriptive, which is to tell you what you should and shouldn't do. That's appropriate if you're writing a textbook for a school. It's not an appropriate way for a scientist to act. Scientists are instead try to describe what's actually going on, describe actual use and structure. So in this sense, nothing anybody says is wrong to a linguist. The linguist's job is to find out what are the underlying regularities that gave rise to what you said. And they might not be in a textbook. So linguistics, when it sees itself as a science, is in a different business than that of teaching foreign languages, for example. Now, one startling claim of Chomsky's, which has had great influence, is the idea that human infants are born ready to learn language, that they couldn't pick it up from the interactions they have with their parents because those interactions are just not suitable enough for learning language. Kids cop on to language far quicker than can be explained by the data they encounter. So Chomsky, who's a very rationalist philosopher as well, has assumed that nature, that is the processes of evolution and biology, have built in somewhere something like a readiness to learn a language. So that when an infant is born, it's not starting from scratch as John Locke would have it, it's not a blank slate, but rather it's using its exposure to the ambient language just to fine-tune an already inbuilt system which he called a universal grammar. On this view, then, languages don't vary arbitrarily, because a language is precisely the kind of thing that a language-learning infant can learn. And we encounter this when we try to make up artificial languages. You may have encountered artificial languages. Klingon, for example, is an artificial language. In the film Avatar, there was another artificial language, Na'vi. And historically, there's been lots of attempts to create artificial languages. You may have heard of Esperanto, for example. It turns out this is a very difficult job, and you actually need to be a linguist to create the building blocks from which any plausible artificial language will be built. So the idea here is that languages don't vary in an uncontrolled fashion. Rather, there's a few little parameters which vary from one language to the next, but all languages can be sorted into a sort of a systematic view, which will allow us to say, yes, these two are languages and they differ in this, with these parameters, but that's just a bunch of words with no structure. So one of these examples of these parameters is found when you have what we call a simple indicative sentence. That's a sentence like John kicked the ball. Very, very simple sentence with someone who's doing something, John, a verb, kicked, and something to which things are done, the ball. And in English, that's the order in which they come. John first, then kicked, then the ball. Pretty much every language can form a sentence like this, but that order comes out differently. About 60% of the world's languages follow English in having this subject, verb, object sequence. But that's one way we can sort languages and say, well, what's your order for this kind of simple sentence? And in Irish, for example, we have a different ordering. If you say, I eat bread, it may aron in Irish, then the verb goes first, and the subject comes second, and the object comes third. So that would be, to come back to our example, as if you had said, kicked John the ball. So this is about 5% of the world's languages follow Irish in this respect. So this canonical word order, as it's called, is one of the things that makes a language belong to one kind of language or another kind of language. Interestingly, you're probably familiar with the character Yoda from Star Wars, and you know he speaks a funny kind of language. Well, one trick that the creators of Yoda have used is that they have him speak English as if it had a different canonical word order. He's not entirely consistent, so don't learn your too much linguistics from Yoda. But when Yoda says something like, much to learn you still have, then the object is coming first, much to learn. Then the subject, you, is coming. And then the verb, still have, is coming. So Chomsky's approach to syntax is to say that what a language is, and a language for him is a system like French or English or Irish, is a set of constraints that differentiate between sequences of words which are acceptable and sequences which are not acceptable, independently, more or less, of their meaning. And this has strong consequences, if you understand language in this way, for what you think a human being is, because on this view, humans are born with a biological capacity to learn language, which includes most of grammar. They only need to set a few switches, a few parameters once they're born in order to be language-using animals. Syntax is concerned with words, and there's a small discipline, sits just below syntax, called morphology. You might think words are the basic unit of language. Well, beneath those we have sounds, or letters, depending on whether we're talking about speaking or writing. But the word, as familiar as it is to us in English, is not an obvious unit in some other languages. In Chinese, for example, it's not entirely clear always what a word is. And so every language has units of meaning that are combined. It's just that in English, we don't generate new words with anything like the facility that some other languages do. Take this, for example. Here's an English word, dog. That has one meaning. It just means the dog. The word dogs, however, has two meanings. It's got the dog in it, and it also has a plural marker. So that's two, what we call morphemes, two meaning-bearing units. The word doubtful, likewise, has two meaning-bearing units. Doubt, which occurs on its own, and full. Likewise, the word cranberry has two meaning-bearing units because berry occurs in raspberry, strawberry, blackberry. Cran doesn't occur in its own, so we call it a bound morpheme. But you can see that words can be further subdivided into meaningful elements. So words have an internal structure of some sort. Now, German is much different from English in this respect, in that you can fluidly, and on the fly, you can create new words in German by stringing morphemes together. So there's a ghastly example there. Rindfleischetikettungsüberwachungsaufgabenübertragungsgesetz. My heavens. Don't even ask me what it means. It's about a law for labeling beef. And I forget whether I built it or someone else built it, but you can invent words like this in German in a way you can't in English. That's why we don't say the word is the most basic meaning-bearing unit in a language, because not all languages have words in the same way English has words. We say the morpheme is. And this is of interest to people who think, well, what does your knowledge of a language consist in? For example, if you are capable of using the word dogs, does that mean that dogs exists as a word in your mental vocabulary? Or does it mean that dog and the ability to form a plural exist and become combined? Psycholinguists worry about such questions. And one fun thing that morphology gives us is some tools for investigating the structure of words. And I say this because it might not be obvious to you that words have an internal structure. Take the word fantastic, for example. It has 3 syllables, fantastic. They're in sequence. Now you might ask, is it just a sequence of 3 syllables? Or is there anything more to the structure of this word? And one method that morphologists use to study this kind of thing, it's a weird scientific instrument, is expletive infixation. Let me explain. And I'm going to curse now. Okay, so beware. The word fantastic can be altered to make fan-fucking-tastic. Now notice where that expletive went. It went between the first 2 syllables. Can we put it in this between the second and the third syllable? Fantas-fucking-stick. No, we can't. That just doesn't work. As a speaker of English, you should be able to tell fan-fucking-tastic is all right, fantas-fucking-stick is an unholy mess. And that shows us that this word has structure, that the position between the first two syllables is not the same as the position between the second two syllables. What a fun scientific tool. So, one thing that happens in a language like German, where people are very free to invent words all the time, is something like COVID comes around. And apparently the COVID crisis produced over 1,200 new words in German. So words like Corona-müde, tired of COVID, or Impfneid, envy of those who have been vaccinated. English doesn't have that kind of productive use of new words. And I've added an article to the suggested reading for this week if you're interested in that strange instrument of expletive infixation, which goes into the fan-fucking-tastic and draws heavily on some creative use of words from The Simpsons. It's quite an entertaining article.